So this is our return to the Ruyer reading group. So we read Ruyer's previous, or the other book, Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. We finished that a few weeks ago, and then we spent a couple weeks reading Canguilhem article. And then now we're picking up a new Ruyer book. So this book, the title of this book is Neofinalism. This one was actually published a few years earlier than the one we read before. So we were doing sort of not chronological order. I forget actually what year this one was. Yeah, so I won't say too much about the book. This one was originally published in French 1952, and then Cybernetics and the Origin of Information was published in French 1954, and then the second edition with the additional chapter that we read, I think was 1965. I can't remember. Anyway, yeah, so I won't say too much about the book because we haven't read any of it yet, but I guess the title already suggests, that it's going to talk about the concept of finalism. This has to do with, is there something in the world such as an end? So obviously, in the case of human beings, we do things for a reason or to achieve some goal, etc. You brush your teeth so that you don't have to have your teeth removed or have cavities filled or whatever, or just for general dental health. I haven't heard Aristotle use that example, but anyway, you do things because you want to achieve a certain purpose or prevent some negative outcome, etc. You have this sort of finalistic or teleological character to your actions, and then in the case of living beings, there's of course this long tradition, this Aristotelian tradition in large part that sees living things in finalistic terms. So sometimes there's like the sort of external teleology that is often mocked and is not exact. It's not really what he's talking about here. So this is like sheep exist so that humans can make wool clothes. So this is like not the kind of teleology that any biologist I think would take seriously. The more sort of interesting kind of teleology or finality is an internal teleology. So when you're thinking about, say, the heart of a mammal, the heart exists for circulating blood. It would be a teleological statement. Biologists, even when they don't think that teleology or finality is a sort of real property of living beings, almost inescapably use like function language, say that the function of this organ is X, or this sort of chemical that is released by this gland, has this function, et cetera, et cetera. So it's almost impossible to, like, if you try very rigorously to avoid any kind of teleological language in biology, then you might sort of observe that the average concentration of this chemical in the blood increases when this happens, or decreases when this other event happens, or whatever. You can make all kinds of like statistical correlations or whatever, but it's very difficult to sort of grasp how the living being is actually working if all you do is sort of observe different facts about the organism and then connect them with statistical laws or some other sort of pattern, without sort of trying to grasp what the function of this chemical, why does the concentration go up when this event happens or go down when this other event happens. And even at a more sort of like zoomed out level, like if your biological theory, if your like account of what the nature of a living being is can't make sense of a statement like wings are for flying, then it's clear that your philosophy of biology or your framework for biology is lacking. In the more, I guess, sort of like rigorous Darwinian approaches, there's been sort of attempts to sort of reduce teleology to a kind of selection, to a kind of description of selection. So if you say something like wings are for flying, what that is sort of translated into is, organisms with wings were selected for flying, in the sense that the ones that were better able to fly were able to survive and reproduce better than the ones that couldn't. Whether that's like a adequate translation of teleological statements and function statements is a matter of debate. And then of course the one of the big problems with this approach is that we in general don't have anywhere near enough empirical evidence to actually assert that the organisms with better wings were better able to survive and reproduce. For example, like when you look at the sort of the fossil record for the emergence of flight in the bird lineage, for example, there's like a handful of specimens, like fossils that of course, the famous Archaeopteryx, etc. But you have like sort of a handful of snapshots of some of this transition, but you have no way of looking like a true sort of Darwinian account would have to look at like the population of the sort of proto flying dinosaur / bird things and say, okay, the ones that had these wings that were more suited for flying were more successful at reproducing and so on. But we of course don't have anywhere near enough evidence to be able to make that statement. So the sort of assertion that this kind of teleological language about wings being for flying is kind of reducible to this Darwinian statement is kind of like a matter of faith, because we don't have anywhere near the evidence we would need to actually say that this Darwinian statement is true. And so, yeah, so this book is going to deal with these kinds of questions about teleology in what exactly teleology is, and of course he's going to take a sort of pro-teleology position that say that teleology is a real property of the world. It's not sort of projected onto the world by human beings. And he's going to take a very strong pro-teleology stance. And in particular, he argues that it's essentially incomprehensible to deny that teleology exists. We'll see, his argument for that position. I think even starting from the first chapter. Okay, so we can start. I think, I just mentioned we're going to skip all the introductory stuff from other people. We'll just start directly with his text from chapter 1, the axiological cogito. So if someone could pick up from there and read the first page or so.
First page. Chapter 1, the axiological cogito. Today, the problem of quote-unquote God's existence, along with the problem of quote-unquote God's attributes, is obsolete. In any case, the form of this problem suffers from an unfortunate contamination of philosophy by religion, a primitive religion. As with countless religious or semi-religious notions, the spontaneous question today is no longer, is it true, but what does it mean? The substitution of a problem of sense, sens in French, for the problem of existence is typical. In fact, genuine atheism is defined much less by the lack of belief in a being called God than by the lack of belief in the existence of sense in the universe. We clearly benefit from posing a problem of sense instead of a problem of existence. Even those who are inclined to answer negatively have at least the pleasant impression of knowing what they deny, whereas in the case of the traditional questions, quote, the fight between the theist and the atheist is as to whether God shall be called God or shall have some other name, unquote. The parallelism between the problem of God and the problem of sense can also be observed between the types of arguments. The a priori or ontological argument becomes, in the order of sense, the axiological cogito. Just as the ontological argument claims to prove that it is contradictory to deny God's existence, so the axiological cogito tries to show that it is contradictory to completely deny finality and sense in general. But whereas the ontological argument, in many of its classical forms, seems to be a deplorable sophism, the axiological quote-unquote cogito is perfectly irrefutable. It is absolutely clear that at least one being in the universe, quote-unquote, offers a sense, man. Not man in general, but each man, each quote-unquote I, when he is the subject who speaks and acts. Each I quite easily finds the others, quote-unquote, absurd, and is inclined to welcome the numerous and ingenious systems that consider humans as puppets driven by pure causes. but only a few speculative sophists can pretend not to exclude their quote unquote speaking person from the domain of validity of such systems. It is quite clear that to affirm in general that every act is a pure effect of causes and has neither end nor sense is to utter an absurdity, exactly like some lunatics who say, quote, I am dead, unquote, or, quote, I do not exist. For the one who affirms something, affirms it to be true, and admits, therefore, that he sought the true, which is fundamentally incompatible with being driven by pure causes. Let us give a few examples. Yeah, when I first read this earlier today, I was a little bit surprised that this, I mean, I know the book is called Neofinalism, but I was a little bit surprised that he turned to this teleological argument to refute these claims about senselessness. It seems like what I expected him to do is to say something like, the proposition there is no sense in the universe itself has a sense, so it's self-refuting. But instead, he's looking at affirmation, I guess, in particular, and claiming that to affirm something means that you are seeking truth in some way that is irreducible to mere causality.
Yeah, so I think this maybe in part has to do with like the ambiguity of the French word sens, which I think in the translation is like sort of given in brackets. So like sens means like the meaning of a word or a sentence, but also direction. So like which direction uh, does the street run, for example. But I think it's more than just like a sort of play on words because I think so. If you think about, for example, there's the sort of Gracian account of speech acts. So in the sense that when you make a statement, you are sort of taken to be saying something that you want the other person to take as true. So if I say it's raining outside or some other sort of trivial statement assertion about the world, the normal sort of use of that statement is to make someone believe that the assertion you're making is true. So it has a certain directedness to it. It's aiming to do something to achieve a certain end. I mean, you might use an assertion to make many to perform various different actions or to achieve various different ends. You might tell someone it's raining because you want them to put on a raincoat, or you might tell them it's raining because you want them to cancel your picnic plans or whatever. And there could be a million different purposes that are sort of like more final purposes. But the sort of immediate purpose is to have them believe that this assertion is true, and then as a consequence of that, maybe cancel your picnic plans or whatever it is. So there's still this sort of, just by virtue of making an assertion, you are performing an action directed towards the end of having someone believe that that assertion is true. So this is one, I guess, sort of component of what it is to make an assertion is that sort of directness towards an end. And so the argument here is that if you make an assertion that there is no directedness towards an end in the world, that assertion is itself directed toward the end of having people believe that there is no directedness towards an end in the world. And so just by virtue, it's a kind of performative contradiction in the sense that what you assert and the act of asserting it are sort of contradictory to each other. And so so in that sense, it's analogous to these statements like "I am dead" or "I do not exist" or whatever. So that like just by virtue of the fact that you are making that assertion, you clearly are do exist and are not dead. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next bit. Organelles, would you like to read the next page or so?
Sure. I see there's a little French in this section too, and I'm gonna stumble over that. If anyone can help me up front, and also it looks like there's some German down there. So, but I will go ahead and start. So he's following on from the end of the last paragraph here. Let us give a few examples. So, A strict dogmatic behaviorist who does not turn behaviorism into a simple provisional method, affirms that the behavior of human beings, including himself, can always be described in terms of responses to stimuli, and that the connection between stimulus and response, however complicated it may be due to intermediary mechanisms, always has the character of a causal chain and is realized step by step, in brackets here in French, de proche en proche, in strict conformity with the mechanical causality. But if, according to our hypothesis, the behaviorist's spoken or written statements are mere responses to stimuli, how and by what right can he believe that he is more correct than his opponents? The, quote, psychologist of magic and superstition, end quote. His responses, like the reddening of litmus paper, are real fact, but, quote unquote, fact are not synonymous with, quote unquote, true proposition, and his responses of his opponents are facts as much as his own. Why would truth value attach to some and not to others? Let us imagine that to a behaviorist defending his system, someone impolitely replies, "What are you saying is meaningless?" The behaviorist will probably be offended, and yet the interlocutor has simply reiterated the very thesis of the one he is attacking. If, by contrast, an admirer exclaims, "You are right, how true," his endorsement will be a refutation, a pure effect that can be neither right nor wrong. Purely, quote unquote, causalist doctrines can be equally refuted by approval and by criticism, whereas the doctrine of, quote unquote, sense can be equally confirmed by rejection and by endorsement. Should I go on to the next example here, or do you want to discuss this one?
Yeah, you can go on to B and C, I think, like the end of C.
Okay, great. All right. So example B. Kohler pokes fun at the behaviorist thesis, as well as at the associationist thesis in general, and ironically regrets that it is not true. In fact, he says, quote, "I have promised a New York publisher to send him the manuscript of this work in a few months. I have to write it in English, even though my mother tongue is German. What a pity that I cannot let my responses to stimuli take their course." End quote. In fact, he experiences an unpleasant feeling before the difficulties of his task. Quote, "an obscure pressure, which tends to develop into a feeling of being hunted." End quote. His thesis, the well-known thesis of Gestalt psychology, is then is that an act has a dynamic, non-mechanical nature, and that the psychological tension of the task, of the end to be achieved, corresponds to a dynamic tension on the physiological plane. The sense, the order of the acts in space and time, quote, is a faithful representation of a corresponding concrete order and the underlying dynamic context, end quote. The quote unquote gestaltist thesis sounds better than the behaviorist or mechanistic one. It seems to do greater justice to the reality of tension, to the reality of the guided effort. But physiologically, it is no better. If the writing of his manuscript simply corresponds to the establishment of an equilibrium in his quote underlying physiological context, end quote, we do not see why Kohler should be more concerned than if he had let his responses to stimuli take their course. Above all, why would his manuscript have the least philosophical value, the least truth value? Once he has finished writing, the author will simply reach a more pleasant state of relaxation, free of the quote unquote obscure inner pressure. He can, of course, answer that this relaxation will not be achieved unless the task is not only brought to an end, but is, quote, successfully carried out, unquote, and is fruitful in his eyes. If this is true, then we are obviously no longer dealing with a pure dynamism. Ultimately, if the task is successful, there will be a coincidence not with a state of equilibrium, but with an ideal, and the prior activity will have had a sense, not only as a vector in physics, but as a conscious intention. Example C. To cut matters short, let us introduce at once several other representatives of the general thesis that claim to explain human activity by impulses, a tergo, and not by an effort to conform to norms. a mechanistic biologist, an old-fashioned psychiatrist who recognizes only physiological disturbances, a Freudian psychoanalyst, an Adlerian, a Marxist sociologist, and a disciple of Pareto. Let us examine that they are all listening to a man expressing, with abnormal brio, his political opinions to a friend. Now we get into a conversation. The psychiatrist. This man is having a hypomaniacal fit. The Freudian. The defiance of authority betrays an infantile hatred of the father. The Adlerian. For what inferiority is he trying to compensate? Pareto's disciple. What are the quote-unquote residues of the verbal quote-unquote derivations? The Marxist. What class interest does he obey? He's a bourgeois intellectual having a pseudo-democratic crisis. Rabaud's disciple. This is the simple effect of an upset metabolism, perhaps a calcium deficiency. All these interpretations are valuable, provided they only claim to define elements that disturb a fundamentally autonomous activity, an activity that finds its laws in the fidelity to an order of truth or ideal validity. At bottom, the friend who really listens and tries to understand and to judge is right to look for reasons behind these outbursts. But if the expert interpretations claim to be self-sufficient and to do away with the simple question of knowing whether the speaker is right, whether the outbursts have a sense, they become absurd. In the first place, they contradict one another. X's political opinions cannot be explained at one and the same time by his physiology, his infantile complexes, his libido, and his class interests. Of course, the learned diagnosticians could reach an amicable compromise and create a parallelogram of forces whose outcome would be the patient's behavior. But the curious quarrels between psychoanalysts and Marxists, for example, show that such a compromise is hardly possible and that they contradict one another because each claims to explain everything. Could I go on here, or do we want to catch up?
Yeah, let's stop here and we can discuss these examples. Sorry,
Yeah.
just a second. Let me come back to that
Yeah,
tab.
and I misspoke. That was not a conversation. That was just each of those giving their own example explanation of what was occurring there.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so he goes through. So each of these examples is an attempt at explaining behavior, or is a sort of like framework for explaining human behavior in causal terms. In the sense that you rather than saying someone is acting, for the sake of some goal to achieve some goal, you give a cause for their action. So like maybe the first one is probably the sort of crudest one, and I think it's pointed out in the chat. It's pretty funny that the sort of behaviorist says all your explanations in terms of goals that people are trying to achieve should be just replaced by these conditioning explanations. So you make this, or you make these sounds that we take to be words in form of sentence, etc. You just produce those sounds because of like the conditioning that you've received over the course of your lifetime, that whenever you produce this kind of sound you got a reward, and then when you produce this other kind of sound you got a punishment. And so you should the more sort of like extreme behaviorists would say that talking about meaning or goals and these kinds of things is a kind of like mythological psychology, and it's no better than explaining things in terms of spirits and whatever, and everything should just be explained in terms of conditioning and responses. And of course the objection you can give to that is just that if that account were true, then the pronouncement of that account itself would also be just a matter of conditioning. So the behaviorist psychologists had been rewarded in the past for expressing or for making sounds that we take to be expressing support for behaviorism, and maybe had been punished for making other sounds that we take to be expressing approval for other psychological frameworks. And so there's no particular reason to take the fact that someone has been conditioned to make sounds that express support for behaviorism as as a reason to think that behaviorism is true. And then and again, you can sort of point to this like performative contradiction that if the behaviorist gives their lecture and about why behaviorism is the one true theory of psychology, and you stand up after and say that's all meaningless, they're probably going to get angry and be offended by that statement. But strictly speaking, of course, they themselves should be taking their own statement to be meaningless. That because they don't think there are meanings at all. So it's this performative contradiction that you assert something that your act of asserting sort of contradicts or is in opposition to. And all these other accounts, the Gestalt psychologist, the what are the other ones? We have the psychiatrist, Freudian, Adlerian, etc. All these other theories that they're all various ways of trying to give like the cause for someone's behavior. So that in the Gestalt psychology case, it's not just these sort of conditioning sequences. It's not that you have been conditioned to I don't know, write your book in English, for example. It's that you have this sort of dynamic tension that is reduced by finishing the project you've taken on of writing this book. That might be in some ways a better description of the situation, but it still is just a sequence of causes. So the Gestalt psychologist, for example, who sort of removes this source of tension in this dynamic situation by writing a book about Gestalt psychology. Again, the fact that someone has reduced their tension in this way is not any reason to think that that account is correct or true. I'm sure someone else could, reduce their tension by, writing a book that explains human behavior in terms of astrology or, whatever other, theory of behavior. And so, again, this sort of reduction of tension explanation is a description of a causal process that brings about behavior, but it doesn't. If we take it that all behavior is explained in this way, then the proffering that theory is itself to be explained in that way, and then we have no reason to think that that theory would be true any more than any similar process of proffering another theory, which would also be explainable in those terms. And this same sort of structure of argument. He doesn't go through it in as much detail, of course, but you can do the same thing for any of these other, Freudian, whatever other theories that, claim to be giving a causal explanation for human behavior. And then the sort of additional argument that you can give is that, just the multiplicity of these theories itself, gives reason for skepticism. So if you have like 7 different theories that are all claiming to give the causal explanation for human behavior, you could maybe find a way of like, combining them and say that, X% of the behavior is due to, unconscious drives, and then Y% is due to conditioning and whatever, or maybe some more complicated and subtle way of, fitting them together. But they each at least are sort of claiming to be the most important or the most fundamental explanation of behavior, and they can't all be the most important or all the most fundamental. So the fact that there are these multiple theories that claim to be giving this causal account of human behavior, it at least raises the problem of how we can select one that is the most important, or how we fit them together in a way that doesn't sort of make them contradict each other, or what we're supposed to do with this multiplicity of theories. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit here. I think we're at if the materialist, is that right? Okay. I'll read this bit. Okay. If the materialist or the psychoanalyst looked for the true causes of human actions with a fierce and heroic care for truth, these doctrines would immediately regain their validity, but they would have to disavow at the same time their hegemonic claims. The doctrines are nothing more than contributions to truth. Their advocates can then say, like Max Weber, truth, quote, truth is the only thing that is true, unquote. Ruyer, as is well known, discovered the axiological form of the quote-unquote cogito from a different or apparently different angle, that of freedom. Quote, I seek a first truth, therefore I am free. Freedom is the first truth I sought, since the search for knowledge implies freedom, the positive condition of the search, unquote. The structure of the argument is the same. At bottom, even the content is identical because the freedom thus discovered is correlated to the end and to sense. Freedom consists in working toward an end according to a norm, in this case, the rule of the search for the true. It is synonymous with finalist activity and not with quote-unquote free will, pure quote-unquote spontaneity, quote-unquote unpredictability, or quote-unquote absolute existential freedom. It is not incompatible with every motivation, but only with a causality a tergo. Renouvier systematized Lequier's argument by elaborating a statement of his, quote, two hypotheses, freedom or necessity. Choose between one and the other, with one or with the other, unquote. And by complicating it with the notion of a morally superior choice in accordance with practical reason. We shall leave these complications aside and shall borrow from Renouvier the form of the double dilemma. He writes, quote, Lequier has shown that the choice required by the alternative, interior quote, necessity or freedom, unquote, if it is considered in the determination of the philosopher's consciousness, depends on the same alternative considered in re or with respect to the external truth of the matter. Close the external quote. There are only four possible hypotheses. Determined, I affirm my determinism. Sorry, that's the first hypothesis. 2, free, I affirm my determinism. 3, determined, I affirm my freedom. Or 4, free, I affirm my freedom. Hypotheses 1 and 3 have to be eliminated because they lack any possible truth value. In this case, my affirmation has just the appearance of an assertion. It is the effect of a pure cause a tergo. Hypotheses 2 and 4 remain. In both cases, my affirmation has a sense and deserves to be taken into account. Yet in the same way that Cartesian doubt is identical to the certainty of existing, if I affirm determinism as a truth, this affirmation amounts to affirming that I sought the truth. One can only seek freely. The affirmation and the negation of freedom amount to the same thing. The negation of freedom, in words or in my philosophical consciousness, amounts to affirming it in re. It is clear that the whole force of the double dilemma is borrowed from Lequier's argument. I'll stop here because there's a bit more that goes on with this. So this is sort of like, I guess, drawing the lesson from the examples above and how they sort of each run into this performative contradiction. So, and just sort of like formalizing what is going on in this, in each of these cases. So, so as he says here, the structure of the argument is the same. So we're trying to sort of extract this, common structure to the argument in each of these cases. And so we have sort of two hypotheses, two possibilities about, in this case, determinism. So either my actions are determined by causes in some sense. So this could be behaviorist conditioning or Freudian unconscious or any of these other possible forms of explanation. Or I am free in the sense of so as you point out, this doesn't mean something like not determined by causation or unpredictable or anything like that. What it means here is just sort of directed in accordance with a norm or teleology in the general sense. So these are sort of the alternative possibilities. Either I'm determined by causes or I am free in the sense of guiding my behavior in light of norms. And then under each of these hypotheses, I can either affirm that I am determined or I can affirm that I am free. So that gives four possibilities. The two ways that the world could be and the two assertions I can make about the world in each of those cases. And so you can sort of exclude the two cases in which I am determined by some sort of causal process, because in each of those cases, my assertion is also the result of a causal process. And as we talked about in the last section, or in the last part we read, each of those causal processes would bring about my assertion, but there's no reason to think that that assertion would be true as a result of that causal process. My conditioning or my unconscious drives or whatever could just as well make me assert something false as they could make me assert something true. And more if you take it sort of more rigorously, then these causal processes would be neither true nor false. It's just a thing that happens in the world, the same way that the litmus paper changes color in contact with an acid. So the two possibilities are either that I'm free and I affirm that I'm determined, or I'm free and I affirm my freedom. And the first one, the I'm free but I affirm that I'm determined, has that sort of performative contradiction in it. It's the same, it has the same form as asserting I am dead or I do not exist. So that only leaves the one case where I'm free and I affirm that I am free. So that's sort of you have these four possibilities and you eliminate the other three, so you're left only with that one. So that's the sort of general form of this argument. Okay, yeah, we can go on to the next bit. So he's going to give like a bit of a qualification of this argument in the next bit. Yeah, so someone else could pick up from the complexity.
I could read again unless 61 you want to read. Okay. Yeah, I'll read the next section. The complexity of the Renouviérist form is not without its danger. It risks making an impregnable argument look like a sophism. Nothing is easier than to caricature the argument for the inattentive reader. Suppose I have to prove my infallibility and not my freedom. I can then say, 1. Fallible in fact, I affirm my fallibility. 2. Infallible in fact, I affirm my fallibility. 3. Fallible in fact, I affirm my infallibility. And 4. Infallible in fact, I affirm my infallibility. Statements 1 and 3 should be eliminated because I am fallible in fact. What I say does not count. Statements 2 and 4 remain, but 2 is contradictory. Therefore, 4 remains. QED. Obviously, this is just a caricature. Unlike determinism, fallibility does not absolutely disqualify my assertions. The contradiction in 2 shows that the affirmation of infallibility implies a logical contradiction, and that is precisely what has to be eliminated. What gives the double dilemma its sophistic aspect, even in its legitimate applications, is that the statements of the alternative in re, or as Renouvier says, quote, with respect to the external truth of the matter, unquote, are written or spoken philosophical statements which imply hypothetical stances and not real facts. Quote, the hypothesis that X is a fact, unquote, is not equivalent to, quote, X as a given fact, unquote. When I say in the double dilemma, quote, determined I affirm, unquote, or, quote, free I affirm, unquote, and so on, the argument means, quote unquote, determined in fact, or quote unquote, free in fact. But because it is a matter of an argument that I am stating, the would-be fact is itself the object of a supposition and uncertain judgment. And the proof is that, in the end, I will reject the would-be fact of determinism. The formulation of the hypothesis about the fact should thus explicitly form a first layer, which is more fundamental than the alternative in re. So he reformulates 2 of the options in table form, so that the first one says, I suppose that, determined in fact, I affirm determinism. The second one says, I suppose that, free in fact, I affirm determinism, etc. So we can clearly see that the would-be facts are not facts. The double dilemma finds itself in the unfortunate situation of the classical ontological argument, which presupposes the idea of a perfect being before inferring that perfection implies existence. It thus presupposes existence and does not prove it, because it presupposes the idea of the perfect, which is presumed to contain existence in re. The second table, I suppose the idea of the perfect, and this implies the existence in re of the perfect. The quote-unquote fact, the truth in re, is here in case 3 and not in case 2, as in Renouvier's argument. But in both cases, in Renouvier's argument and in the ontological argument, the quote-unquote I suppose prevents us from taking the fact seriously. If Renouvier's double dilemma is nevertheless valid, this is because the fundamental supposition itself, layer 1, regardless of its content, is already the express manifestation of freedom. To say, I suppose, is already to be free. It also shows that one seeks the true and knows in advance that it exists. So much complication comes down to the simple form of Lacquier's argument. Every assertion coming after a search, whatever its content may be, includes the primacy of the true, of freedom, of quote-unquote sense, and of existence as senseful activity. Lacquier's argument and the Cartesian quote-unquote cogito are identical. They are valid only in their axiological scope. With careful precautions, the double dilemma can be conserved as a kind of sensitive scale or an assay balance for testing equivalent concepts. It immediately proves that there is a sense in human activity and that a totalitarian philosophy of the absurd is absurd. So this is the, I guess, revised double dilemma. 1. Being a pure set of processes, I affirm that my activity is senseless. 2. Pursuing senseful ends, I affirm the absurd nature of my activity. 3. Being a pure set of processes, I affirm that my activity has a sense. 4. Pursuing senseful ends, I affirm that my activity has a sense. Assertions 1 and 3 eliminate themselves. The fact that assertion 2 is an assertion completely undermines it, so assertion 4 remains. So I guess where he comes out here is that even though this double dilemma has this kind of hidden, assumed layer that I am supposing that I am determined in fact or free in fact, this doesn't invalidate it as applied to what he's calling the axiological cogito, because supposing determination or freedom in fact themselves presuppose that you are seeking the true in some sense.
Yeah, so this bit I think is a bit subtle, but yeah, so it's maybe important to go through it carefully here. So in the previous page or so that we read, he gave this maybe more straightforward account of this double dilemma. So either so I'm either determined or free as a fact about the world, and then in each of these cases I can either affirm that I'm determined or affirm that I'm free. And then he points out in this next bit, one that we just read, that you can make a very similar argument to prove, in scare quotes, prove that you are infallible. So I can, I'm either fallible or I'm infallible, and I can either assert that I'm fallible or assert that I'm infallible. And you can eliminate all the cases except the one where I am infallible and I affirm that I'm infallible. And so, clearly this is a bad argument that it's you can't reach infallibility quite so easily, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know. And the reason why this doesn't work is that there's a kind of hidden layer in the double dilemma argument. So that sort of blocks the move from like the infallibility assertion to the infallibility in fact. And so in the case where I'm talking about determinism, I say that there are these two cases: either I'm determined or I'm free, and then two assertions I can make in each of those cases: either I assert that I'm determined or I assert that I'm free. But when I start from these two cases, whether the case where I'm determined or the case where I'm free, these are themselves suppositions or hypotheses. So they're supposed to be representations of the world. They're supposed to be facts about me. But of course, they're sort of taking place in the realm of my sort of philosophical suppositions or hypotheses about the world. And the sort of proof of this, as he points out, is the fact that I'm eventually going to eliminate one of these hypotheses, namely the one where I'm determined. So yeah, both of these hypotheses are like sort of objects of my supposition or my philosophical representation of the world, and are not sort of immediately facts about the world or true statements about the world. So you have to sort of append at the beginning, I suppose that, for each of these positions. And then, so in the case of the infallibility, once you sort of add that I suppose that at the beginning, then the argument clearly doesn't go through, because supposing that you are infallible and being infallible are not the same thing. And then, so he points out that this is similar to one of the main objections to the ontological argument for the existence of God, and this is he doesn't mention Kant by name here, but this is the objection that Kant made to Descartes' formulation of this argument. So Kant talked about, of course, maybe I'll go back and explain the ontological argument a little bit. So Descartes presents it in terms of this idea of the perfect being, and because existence is a perfection, if we were to suppose that the perfect being did not exist, then we would be able to suppose that there were a more perfect being, which would be that being plus existence. But this contradicts the idea of the perfect being. Therefore, the perfect being has to exist. And Kant points out that, or Kant's argument is that existence is not a property of a being in the same way that being red or being tall or being triangular or whatever is. And so he says if you have the idea of $100, there's no difference between this idea of $100 and the $100 themselves, other than the existence. Because if there were a difference, then it wouldn't be the idea precisely of the $100. It would be an idea of something else. But of course, there's a big difference between having an idea of $100 and having $100 in your wallet. Like you can buy something with the real $100, but you can't, unfortunately, buy anything with the idea of $100. And so for Kant, this existence, the difference between the idea of $100 and the real $100 is something outside the concept. It's this kind of non-conceptual difference, and therefore this when you're talking about the idea of the perfect being, you can't sort of extract existence from that idea itself. So yeah, there's this kind of non-conceptual nature. He sometimes uses this term pure position. So like if you already have this concept of the perfect being, you have to sort of take that extra non-conceptual step of sort of taking that perfect being to be a real existing entity. And this is, so the concept is the same whether the entity exists or not, or whether you take the entity to exist or not, but you are making this extra step that is not conceptual or reducible to a concept, or explicable in terms of a concept. This extra step of positing this being as something that exists. So this is something extra, outside of the conceptual realm in that sense. So this is, again, the same type of argument in the sense that you have to sort of step outside of the conceptual to get to this existence, or the fact that the idea of the perfect being and the perfect being as an existing entity are not the same thing, blocks you from sort of getting from this idea of perfection, or of the perfect being, to the existence of the perfect being. But the sort of next stage in Ruyer's argument here is to assert that this invalid argument, or the blocking of the argument in the case of this ontological argument, or the supposed proof of my infallibility, doesn't obtain when dealing with this sort of axiological realm, or the normative realm, or whatever you want to call it, in the case where you are making the argument about the normative as such, or the teleological as such. So when you're trying to make an argument that sort of goes outside of this realm of sense, or the conceptual realm, in the case of the ontological argument, or the infallibility argument, then it doesn't work. But if you are sort of staying within the realm of sense, if your argument is precisely about whether there is sense as such at all, then that argument actually does work. So this is sort of like the more restricted domain of validity of the double dilemma. So once you, and then he points out that once you have that sort of first layer of saying, I suppose that I suppose that the world is determined, or I suppose that I am free, or whatever your supposition is, you're already in the realm of sense. You're already making an assertion that is aiming at the true, and therefore that argument, this form of argument that didn't work in the case of the ontological argument, or the infallibility argument does work when you are, dealing with whether there is sense, whether there is teleology in the world.
So this may be a naive question, but so for Ruyer, why is he doing this? Like, why is it important for him to show that these I guess teleological statements and mechanisms are kind of inherent? Like, what is he getting at here, other than just proving that there is some assumption of teleology underlying most of this. I don't know if that was if I asked that question right, but
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So maybe the cheap answer would be that we'll have to read the whole book and find out what the point of the book is. That's maybe not a very satisfying answer.
that that makes sense though.
Yeah, I mean, so to be a little bit less cheap, I think he, like, similar to his sort of general, I guess, approach in the cybernetics book. So in that book, he, took cybernetics to be, an important contribution to our understanding of living beings, including humans, but sort of going too far when it sort of tries to reduce human behavior and even behavior of living beings and the sort of ontogeny of living beings as being explicable in terms of these like feedback processes and so on. So cybernetics, is something useful and helpful in grasping this pattern, that the feedback nature of the governing of behavior, for example. But if you try to take it that this sort of explains away teleology, if you try to say that directedness towards a goal just is the same as the thermostat that keeps the temperature within a certain range by feedback mechanisms, then you have sort of overextended this argument or this sort of form of explanation, and you're making it do something that it's not capable of doing. And so I think he's gonna, like, this book is, I mean, as I mentioned, this book actually comes before the cybernetics book, but it does sort of a more general. It does the same thing in a more general sense. So he wants to say that all of these types of positions that would try to sort of explain away teleology, whether it's behaviorism or psychoanalysis or whatever, any sort of position that says what seems like teleology is really just the result of this kind of causal process that is doing something in this way. Any of these positions are also, they might tell us something interesting and important and give us insight into human behavior or biology or whatever domain they're dealing with. But when you sort of extend it to this kind of explaining away of teleology, that is making it do something that it's not actually capable of doing. So I think that's his general sort of mission in this book is to sort of like block this overextension of these kinds of causal arguments to sort of explain away teleology and say you actually can't get this philosophical lesson from these potentially useful and important scientific theories about the causal processes that are involved in whether it's the development of living beings or behavior of living beings, including humans and so on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to suggest that we maybe stop here rather than getting into the next chapter. Just because it's a good stopping point and we don't have too much time left, and also I need to get some breakfast. So I think the next chapter is a bit longer, if I remember correctly. So it would probably take us a couple sessions to get through. Oh, actually, no, sorry. The next one is very short. So we might get through the next one in one session as well. But yeah, we can. Sorry. I should also mention I'm going to be traveling again this weekend, this coming week. So we'll have to unfortunately miss another week and then pick up the following chapter the week after. Okay. Maybe we can discuss timing like over chat after the session, if decide whether we want to go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, yeah. Thanks everyone for coming out. Yeah. Hopefully we will have some good. Yeah. I think this book should be pretty interesting. To go through. Yeah. The more, I guess, general philosophical arguments. There's still a lot, I think, of sort of more sort of close look at different biological, you know, theories and experiments and so on. That, you know, in the same way that the previous book had some close looks at cybernetic, you know, devices and theories and so on. So I think it's a good mix of philosophical argumentation and also, you know, close look at the sort of scientific theories, you know, of his day, of course, which are not always not always relevant to today's biology, but often, I think, more often than maybe you would expect, are still relevant. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming out, and yeah, we'll figure out in the next little bit what the next session will be. But yeah, stay tuned.